Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and in this one I kind of want to go more in depth on all the procedural ASCII art stuff that I talked about over on the CG Matter channel. If you haven't seen that video, go watch it, but the basic idea is we want to take images and turn them into ASCII art, which is normally something that you take a long time to do manually, or maybe you throw it into a program, but it turns out Blender can do it very nicely. So for example, we have this image of a dog. Let me just make that normal. We have this image of a dog, which kind of looks very, very high contrast. I can get rid of that, but it doesn't really matter. And then you can see this node network I've created here, which looks like a lot, but honestly it's not that much. Just converts it into ASCII art, and we actually have a lot of control over stuff like the resolution, meaning, you know, how many symbols. So this is very low resolution, so 45 by 45 symbols. We can make that higher, or we can make that very dense. So, you know, it kind of gives more resolution even though it's made out of the same components. We also have control over, we have some basic controls to kind of say, oh, where do we want some of these symbols? And yeah, I'm just going to be explaining how to make this node network in a way that makes sense. And by the end of this tutorial, you'll understand how to make this yourself when we go full screen, and it won't be that intimidating. That being said, just for you to know, the ASCII art network that I use for the CG Matter tutorial is much more complex because it can do any number of symbols, and it also uses like OSL scripting and all this, but there's nothing wrong with this method. Generally 3 symbols, which is what we're going to be using, will get you pretty much any image you want. So just one more thing I swear before we hop into it, because it is going to be a bit complex, is I just want to show you that this works with any image. So here's another image I've loaded. It's the Blender Nest logo now in nice symbols, which is the podcast I'm in. And this is what the image looks like originally. So you can see how that came to be. So let's start off with a new Blender scene. So assuming that you've installed Blender normally and you haven't like messed with any add-ons, this is what your startup scene is going to look like. So what we're going to do is I'm going to delete the default cube, replace it with a plane. This is where we're going to put our image, and head over to the shading workspace. And if you think to yourself, oh, is this a tutorial all about nodes? Yeah, we're pretty much not leaving this shading workspace. And in fact, I'm pretty sure the way we're going to do this is also EV compatible, which means no need to change this, and it's going to calculate very fast. So let's create a new material. I'm going to call this ASCII art. And I guess the first order of business is picking a picture. So Shift-A to add a node. Image texture, I'm going to assume that you haven't had much practice with nodes, so I'm going to explain the theory of everything going on. So image texture nodes, where we're going to load our image. I'm going to choose one from the desktop. I like the dog picture, just because I've already experimented with this one, but again, it works with video as well, any image sequence. We're going to take this and plug it into the surface. And one final thing, I swear, before we really get into weeds here, go to Edit Preferences, Add-ons, and if you do not have Node Wrangler, if I can spell it right, Node Wrangler installed, you're missing out. You don't have to have it installed, but you suck if you don't. And it's going to let you do a lot of shortcuts like this. Okay, so the first order of business is taking this image and making it discrete. And you're probably like, I have no idea what he just said. Basically, we want to take this image and make it pixelated, because right now we can just keep zooming in, and it does get kind of blurry, but it does have quite a bit of detail. And if you think about ASCII art, it kind of looks like very low resolution, if that makes any sense. It's kind of made out of cells. So the first step is to turn this into a pixelated image, and then also make it black and white, so we can choose, using that, different symbols we can use, which I swear will make more sense. So to make this pixelated, a classic trick is you're going to add a Voronoi texture node, and we're going to use the position, which you can see is a vector output, and this is a vector input. We're going to use this as our texture coordinates input, which kind of gives us a weird stained glass thing, which is cool on its own, but we're going to decrease the randomness to make it kind of cellular, very grid-like. And then the scale is just going to affect the resolution. And you can see we've recovered our original image, but now we can control how pixelated we want it. So that's pretty cool. This scale is going to be pretty much, let's say we have 40. It's going to say, oh, we're going to have 40 cells by 40 cells. But we can also do stuff like 40.5, which is fine, but it doesn't really make sense for ASCII art because you can't have half an ASCII symbol. So what we're going to do is we are going to add a value node and just plug it in here, so really nothing has changed. If I set this to 40, we just kind of made a node instead of typing it in here. And then we're also going to add in a math node and set this to either floor, ceiling, or round. It doesn't matter. And the ceiling is just going to round up so that we only get integers in here. So we can't have like half pixels and all that. So this is going to be 41, and you see kind of just snaps instead of being this continuous flow. Okay, cool. But you're going to see, I'm going to make this a small number. You're going to see that already we have an issue, which is unfortunate. And that is that we have kind of like half pixels over here. So even though we're supposed to have 8, you can count them. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the 8th pixel is divided in 2. So to fix this, we either need to like nudge it over left and down a pixel or half a pixel, or nudge it up and right half a pixel to kind of get rid of this offset. We need to offset by half a pixel to get rid of it. Okay, so that kind of sounds a bit complicated, but probably not the hardest thing in the world. So what we're going to do is this Voronoi texture also has texture coordinates of its own. So if you have Node Wrangler, Control T to add those, although we don't need the mapping, I don't think. So really, I'm just adding a texture coordinate with generated, so you can do that manually if you want. So generated goes in here. And I guess we do want the mapping node after all, so Control T is the way to go. What we want to do here is kind of nudge this using the location. You can see this is the offset. However, it's not some random number. It always has to be half a pixel, and half a pixel is a different size depending on our tiling. So half a pixel here is much smaller because we have many more pixels here. So how do we calculate it? Well, let's just think about this just mathematically. In this case, if we have 8, ceiling function is still 8. What we want to do is shift this over half of a like 8th pixel, if that makes any sense. So really, we're dividing our plane into 8 rows, and we need to shift it by half that width to the right and up, or to the left and down. So the way we do that is we're going to add some more math nodes, and we are going to, I guess we could either do the left and right and the up and down separately, or we could do it all at once, which is probably the faster way to do it, so I'm going to do vector math instead. So really, we are just kind of making this process a lot faster. So we are going to take our generated coordinates and add, and this is going to be our offset, as you can see. We're going to add, and now we want to throw in the math nodes. We are going to add, well, we want half of like an 8th, or really depending on how many pixels we have here. So I'm going to divide by this number. So if it's 8, we want to get rid of an 8th of this segment. Hopefully it makes sense. So this updates depending on what number this is. And then a half is actually already in here because divide by having a half in the numerator, it's already doing what we want. It's like 1 over 2 times this number. So we're just going to plug it in. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just put in this math node. I swear it works. And you can see that now we have a nice grid without any bleeding on the side. You know, we have whole pixels, no half pixels, and that updates as well. And really what I was trying to say is that this math node is basically correcting for whatever size we have here. So we have completed step 1, which is taking our image and making it discrete, or really the way to say that is we made it pixelated. Step 2 is to make it black and white. Well, how do we do that? Well, there's a bunch of ways, but probably the fastest is you just type in RGB to black and white. Boom, you've done it. So now we've turned our image into basically a grid of points, and each of the, or of squares, whatever you want to call them, or cells, and each one is going to have a value between 0 and 1, and we can use this to determine what symbol we want. So maybe in a very bright area where it's white, we want there to be an ASCII symbol. That's maybe just a dot, since it's very light in that area. And then where it's very dark, we can have something like a pound sign, something that's kind of looks like cross-hatching. So yes, and again, all this is pretty procedural, and you're also going to notice that there's kind of like lines in between these cells, which is kind of just an artifact of Eevee. If you go to cycles, doesn't exist, so it's kind of an Eevee thing. So hopefully we are up to speed with what we have done so far, because this is honestly the harder part. The rest of this is actually fairly easy. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add in 3 symbols, although you can add in more, and then we're just going to make a little function that says, okay, where it's dark, use a pound sign. Where it's kind of grayish, use a ampersand or an exclamation point or whatever. So what we have to do is import these in. So I'm going to use a image texture. Again, the one I made over at the CG Matter doesn't have all this. because there's OSL scripting, so it auto imports a image sequence, but it's fine. So we have a image texture node that's blank, and we are going to import in. I have a couple symbols to choose from. So the first one's a blank symbol, which you may think, okay, that's kind of useless for ASCII art, but it's not. Basically, wherever you have highlights in your image, wherever it's very blown out, you want it to be perfectly white. So that's why we have that. I'm also going to import in, I don't know, I like this less than or greater than symbol. And then we are also going to import in this pound sign that I was talking before, or as you kids probably call it, a hashtag, you Instagram nerds. Okay, there we go. So now you can see we have 1, which is blank, 2, which is this, and 3. And really we want to, as we said, we want to pick one of these 3 for each of the cells. So for example, like we said, this black cell might have a pound sign, this bright cell might have white, and this gray cell might have the less than or greater than sign. But before we do that, you're going to notice it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really make sense to choose between these because they're way too big. They should be the size of the cell. So instead of having one big pound sign, we should have how many? Round that up, we should have 43 by 43 of these. And this is actually pretty easy to do. What we're going to do is we're just going to take this texture coordinates, and I'm just going to plug it into all these. So these are all going to have generated coordinates, which they already did, or maybe they have UV coordinates by default, but in this case it's the same since it's a plane. So, you know, nothing special there. And what we want to do is do a manipulation to this so that it's kind of tiling. And it just so happens the manipulation for that is you add in a vector math. And then we're going to set this to scale. So really we are just making this input scaled by this number, and we're just going to make that bigger. And you can see that already does what we want it to, and you may be thinking, okay, we're making these coordinates bigger, why does it tile? Well, that's just a consequence of, we're viewing this one. I think that's just a consequence of this being set to repeat. If we had this set to clip, it doesn't do that. It just scales the original image how you'd expect. But we do have this set to repeat, which just means instead of having it black, it's just going to take this and tile it a bunch of times, which in this case is very convenient. But we don't want to just scale this by 12.4. We want to scale this by this number that we've defined before, that we also round up with our ceiling function. So you take this, plug it in. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that this value not only pixelates our image, but also controls the density of this. Which, by the way, since it's going to all 3 of these, same for all these. Again, this one's just white, so technically we don't even need that. But you can see we now have a bunch of symbols. So now what we have to do is mix between them. We have to say, where do we want each of these to be? And this is where it gets a bit confusing, but the way I like to think about this is, again, white is going to be the brightest parts of our image. This is going to be the grayish parts of our image, and this is going to be the darkest parts of our image. So I'm going to start by mixing these two together. So either add a mix RGB node, like a pleb, or if you have Node Wrangler, Control-Shift, right-click, drag, adds a mix RGB. And right now, and you really need to think about this, right now the bottom socket is the foreground. Right now we have our pound sign in the foreground. So what we want to do is define where do we want the pound sign to be. In other words, where is the darkest parts of our image. So the way I'm going to do that, there's a bunch of ways to do it, but again, we're going to manipulate this because this is our source input. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a math node, put it in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the darkest parts are where it's less than. So let's say less than some number. So as we bring it down, it's going to only have the dark parts of the image, I think. So this should be the dark parts of the image. Let's compare that to the original. I think that's right. It's really hard to tell what's going on. I guess we'll see. We'll see. It doesn't matter. We can always switch them later. So we're going to take this and use it as the factor. And now we can visualize that, and you can see that now this less than is actually controlling the mixing between these two symbols, which also scales up with our value. It doesn't matter, it still works. And you can kind of see the outline of our dog and the sky swirls and everything. And I'm going to set this to something more clear, like 80, so we can kind of see what's going on. And we can also, on the fly, change this number to kind of get different results. So it's very procedural. Okay, now we've already mixed these two. Now we want to mix this one and this one. So Control Shift, right click, drag. So now we have our second layer of mixing. And by the way, if you wanted 4 symbols, you just, keep this process going. So mix, 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 etc. Again, it's easier with scripting. Okay, cool. So now with this mix node, we want another kind of factor function that we're going to use. So for this one, I want the very bright areas, and I think for this one we want greater than. So greater than some very large-ish number, because that's where it's very blown out and very bright. And we can always, change this in post. I know we're in post, but we can always change this later. So I'm going to take this, and notice that right now our original mix is in the foreground. We don't want that. I'm going to hit Alt-S to switch that. So the way you want to think about this is we've already done one operation, and now we're taking this, overlaying it on top, and using this factor wherever it's white to determine where it is. So let's try that, and let's view it. And now let's see, if we zoom in, you see we have some pound signs, we have some less than, greater than, and we have very few areas where it's completely blank, which is our third symbol technically. And of course, at any point, since this is very procedural, the way we've done this, here's the white texture. We can always swap this out for something like a dot. And now, I guess I put that in. Did I even update that? I've gotten confused. What I'm trying to say is you can always update this. Oh, I forgot. We didn't put this in intentionally because it was white. That came to bite me later. We can always put a dot. And now you see all the blank areas before now have dots in them, which might be another good way to do it because this is almost as blank as a perfectly white thing. So let me, color management, I'm going to set this back to none so we kind of get a high contrast look, and already it's looking pretty good. And what we can do is we can control, again, this slider is basically saying where do we want the blown out areas to be. We can like lower this threshold to get different results. And all this updates super fast, which is very cool. And we can also update this one to kind of get good results, something like this maybe. Now it's kind of hard to tell if this is a good result or we only know what it is because we know what the original image looks like. But for sure, if we increase the resolution, it will get better and better and better. And if we go low, not so much. Okay, cool. And already we have pretty much the node network that I showed in the beginning. But again, we can always just swap out what image we're doing this for, because really all the operations are independent of this, like the pixelation. It doesn't matter what image it is. Oh, my voice just cracked there. We'll leave it in. So here's the Blender Nest logo. You can see that here it's kind of looking very plain, like most of this is dots. And in this case, we'd want to play around with these sliders to get kind of more interesting results. You can see now we have this weird stuff going on. And we can also do it here. Now the Blender Nest text is more defined. And I don't think I showed this in the beginning. This area is our image, right? It's the image and then converting it to black and white. It doesn't have to be that. It can be something like a noise. So we can do this with a noise texture. Again, it really doesn't matter because we're really just doing texture coordinate calculations, plugging it in here, and then using the rest for a mixing factor. So now you can see we have this cool noise pattern that we can animate, and it's entirely made out of ASCII art. And look at that. And if we set this to 4-dimensional, we can animate once it loads. We can do this cool animation out of ASCII art. And the same way that we can do it with a noise texture and an image, you can do this with a movie. And yeah, so this is kind of the naive approach on how you might do this. Because again, if you had more images, you'd have to keep putting them in and keep mixing them in this tower of mixing. But there really isn't a very easy way to do it with default nodes without going into OSL. Technically, there is a way you'd make a sprite sheet, and instead of doing mixing, you'd use texture coordinates to shift over down the sprite sheet. But I do think that 3 symbols actually gives fairly solid results. Surprisingly, you'd think that you'd need like 5 or 6 at least to do it, but really as long as you pick a good ASCII art or good ASCII symbols, then you should be good to go. So let's get some of that detail back in. And I really do like the procedural nature of this quite a bit. There we go. you can always do cool stuff with this. And by the way, once you're done with this, this is basically just defining a texture that we've created, a procedural texture, but there's no reason that we can't use this as a BSDF. So you could just throw in a diffuse BSDF in there. And now you can take your light, wherever it is, somewhere, there it is. You can take it and use it to illuminate different parts of your image. Of course, it's going to be extremely high contrast, so let's go back to sRGB. Now you can see what's going on over there. So yeah, hopefully you understood what I was talking about. I think this is a super cool approach. I don't think many people are like, oh yes, if we're doing ASCII art, let's use Blender to do it. But there you go. You can do it. You can make it fully procedural. You can even throw this all inside a node group, although I'm not going to do that since, whatever. It's not that hard to access different sliders here, but I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and it made a bit more sense. Again, feel free to check out the Gumroad product, which you can get for free if you want, or it's also pay what you want. So if you are in a position where you can donate, I'd greatly appreciate it, because putting out products for free is not a sustainable business model without some generous people deciding to donate, because it's a good product, I think so. But either way, I hope you enjoyed this free tutorial. If you want to support this channel, the Gumroad, and then also Patreon, of course. So if you're into that, I do have a Patreon, and you do get benefits. For example, the people on the Patreon already knew I was doing ASCII art stuff before I released this tutorial. Anyways, hopefully you learned a lot. I hope that this node network now kind of makes more sense structurally. It doesn't just look like a bunch of random blocks. You're like, oh, this part's the texture coordinates calculation, the tiling, and the Voronoi tricks from before. Here's the 3 images, and here we're just mixing it. Hopefully it makes structurally a bit more sense, but other than that, I've been Default Cube CG Matter. You've been you. Bye-bye.